After cycling through 5 prime ministers in less than 2 years, France is grappling with a severe internal crisis that has drawn global attention. This turmoil stems from both the French government's inability to forge a consensus on the 2026 budget proposals and widespread public dissatisfaction over a declining standard of living and the rising cost of existence in the country. These conditions collectively point to a deeply troubled and increasingly problematic economy, one that has struggled to achieve more than a slow, moderate recovery since the 2008 financial crisis. Despite the government's efforts to contain the situation, the nation is struggling to keep its public finances in check. France's public debt has surged past 114% of its GDP, making it the third largest in Europe. Furthermore, the budget deficit is projected to be around 5.4% of GDP in 2025, significantly exceeding the 3% limit set by the European Union. In the current climate, President Emmanuel Macron's administration faces a complex dilemma: how to balance the budget while simultaneously meeting social demands for better wages, increased public investment, and the preservation of social benefits. This duality was starkly highlighted when Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu announced on October 14 the temporary suspension of the pension reform, a measure that would have raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, following extensive public protests demanding the proposal be halted. This chaotic internal scenario reveals serious short- and long-term problems for the country. The French economic challenge has deep roots directly tied to the political and ideological complexities of the post-World War II era. Following the end of the conflict in 1945, France, like much of Western Europe, structured its economic and social model around a comprehensive welfare state designed to meet nearly all the population's needs. To illustrate, between 1950 and 1973, the economic growth of European nations was accompanied by a significant expansion of public spending. In France, government expenditures rose from 27% to 39% of GDP. The central goal of this movement was to rebuild a society profoundly weakened by war, reduce inequality, and ensure social stability through extensive systems of public health care, free education, robust pensions, and worker protection policies. For decades, this system served as the primary engine of prosperity and peace in Europe. Consistent economic growth, coupled with the absence of major conflicts and a resulting reduction in military spending, allowed governments to maintain balanced public accounts and direct resources towards social investments and civil infrastructure. This reality helped Europe become one of the regions with the highest quality of life in the world by the end of the 20th century, attracting thousands of migrants and investments. However, the sustainability of European social welfare models has always depended on a complex combination of economic factors. Major economies like France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom needed to maintain constant growth, high productive capacity, and favorable demographics to ensure a large and stable workforce. This condition was particularly evident until the mid-1970s, when Europe enjoyed a recovered and competitive industrial sector, marked by technological modernization and the growing expansion of large-scale goods production. The significant increase in production guaranteed European countries high employment rates and continuous productivity gains. In other words, wealth generation was broad, and the growth in the number of active workers substantially increased tax collection. This dynamic created a solid fiscal base that allowed the state to finance pension systems, universal health services, free education, and social assistance policies. The French economy benefited greatly from this model, managing to nearly double its GDP between the 1970s and 1980s, surpassing the €1 trillion mark in 1991. Despite the impressive results of previous decades, the relatively stable environment of the main European democracies began to gradually transform starting in the 1970s, driven by structural changes in the global economy. This period saw the progressive transfer of industrial production from the West to Asia, a process that intensified in the following decades. Countries like Japan and South Korea, along with Taiwan and Hong Kong, the Asian tigers, were the first to industrialize rapidly, followed by China and other Southeast Asian nations. These countries offered significantly lower production costs and a vast labor supply, a movement that gained unprecedented scale with the advance of globalization and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, solidifying Asia as the new global manufacturing hub. In contrast, Europe faced increasing difficulties in sustaining its industrial competitiveness. The European social welfare model, while socially robust, imposed high costs on businesses, which had to contend with complex bureaucracies, rigidly regulated labor markets, active unions, and relatively high wages. This made it harder to compete with low-cost Asian products. Consequently, industry became more expensive and less competitive across Europe, while Asia grew as a mass consumer goods producer, flooding the European market with cheaper products compared to those produced locally by European companies. Naturally, the Eurozone economies became less competitive. Companies closed, industries migrated, and industrial regions declined. This translated into slow economic growth for these countries, especially France, which has had to deal with chronic economic stagnation and extremely high debt. The current fiscal challenge is significant. Europe was already facing an economic slowdown, and major economies like France began to register slower growth in the first decade of the 21st century, accompanied by high levels of public debt exceeding 60% of GDP. These indicators pointed to a challenging fiscal scenario even before the 2008 global financial crisis, which shook international markets and aggravated the pressure on the French economy. When the crisis hit France, bank credit was severely restricted, forcing the government to implement support packages to rescue strategic financial institutions. It is estimated that these bailouts represented approximately 1.5% of GDP, accompanied by fiscal adjustments and tax increases. This combination of factors led to a significant increase in public spending relative to GDP growth, while the economy struggled to regain momentum against international competition and the loss of internal competitiveness. As a result, the state began to spend more to contain social deterioration while collecting less due to limited economic growth. This dynamic contributed to public debt surpassing 100% of GDP in 2020, a year marked by an economic contraction of about 7% due to the pandemic. France faces a challenging fiscal landscape where the government seeks to balance austerity measures without compromising the benefits of the social welfare model, which has seen significant deterioration in recent years. This phenomenon can be explained by various structural and cyclical factors impacting the French economy and society. Unemployment, for example, has remained high, fluctuating between 7 and 10% for at least 30 years. Furthermore, the public perception of the cost of living has worsened. Housing and rental prices have increased substantially, particularly impacting sought-after urban areas. Simultaneously, essential public services like health and education face challenges related to quality and accessibility. The scarcity of professionals, the overburdening of institutions, and the need for structural reforms have generated dissatisfaction among citizens, especially in rural and peripheral areas where access to these services is more limited. Despite these challenges, the French social welfare model remains fundamental for the majority of the population, who rely on public services to ensure a decent standard of living. Any reform proposal in this sector frequently triggers popular demonstrations, as evidenced by the protest in March 2023 against the pension reform proposed by President Macron. The reform, which aimed to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, was passed without a parliamentary vote using Article 49.3 of the Constitution, generating widespread opposition and demonstrations across several cities. In response to political and social pressure, Prime Minister Lecornu announced in October 2025 the temporary suspension of the reform until the end of the 2027 presidential elections, aiming to avoid a political crisis and ensure government stability. For President Macron, moving forward with pension reform is vital to relieve the government's public spending, contain the budget deficit, and reduce public debt. The suspension of the reform is expected to cost around 400 million euros in 2026 and up to 1.8 billion euros in 2027. If France does not proceed with its pension reform in the coming years, the country's public debt is projected to reach 130% of GDP by the end of the decade.
Currently, French debt is standing at 114% of GDP, the highest percentage in decades and the third largest in Europe, along with the high budget deficit, which is expected to close at around 5.4% of GDP in 2025, well above the 3% limit stipulated by the European Union. Given this worrying fiscal scenario by European standards, it is easy to understand the difficulty French parliamentarians face in reaching a consensus to define the 2026 budget. Naturally, the market demands austerity measures to balance public accounts and reduce economic risk. On the other hand, parliamentarians fear that these cuts would affect social policies and further undermine the French social welfare system, which is often used as a campaign tool by the country's political class. This inability to reach a consensus in Parliament further harms France, leading to a repetition of political clashes that shake the confidence of markets and investors, leaving the Eurozone's second-largest economy vulnerable to external shocks.
Thus, it is difficult to imagine a scenario where France can implement austerity policies without at least minimally compromising its social and welfare policies. The combination of slowly growing public revenues, rising mandatory expenditures, especially pensions and public services, and policies to support purchasing power, all aggravated by an aging population, makes any proposal for cuts or spending freezes politically unviable, as it would certainly generate strong popular discontent and dissatisfaction. As the Eurozone's second-largest economy, France is facing a dismal fiscal situation, marked by political instability, popular revolt, and decades of public spending without adjusting the budget to the reality of economic growth. This has brought to light self-indebtedness and serious problems that, if not addressed, could mean a difficult reality for the French people, given that debt costs already consume up to 67 billion euros, second only to spending on education and defense. Therefore, the nation must seek political consensus, propose long-term measures, and minimize harm to the population so that the nation can emerge from this difficult situation as quickly as possible.
France is trapped in a fiscal paradox. Decades of robust social spending have created a welfare state the public demands, but the country can no longer afford. With debt soaring past 114% of GDP and political gridlock preventing necessary reforms, the stability of the Eurozone's second-largest economy is now at risk. The inability to find consensus on a budget threatens to destabilize the entire bloc, proving that the French crisis is not just a domestic issue, it's a European liability. What do you think is the solution? Let us know in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe for more analysis, and we'll see you next time.